So let us continue our discussion, doctor. Cerebral blood flow does not depend on what? Autoregulation of cerebral, cardiovascular, renal circulation is one of the high-yield topic for the entrance, which you should master today itself. So basically, doctor, unless the blood pressure is less than 60 millimeters of mercury or more than 150 millimeters of mercury, really there are not much of changes within the cerebral blood flow. So that is the reason, doctor, the auto-regulation by either vasodilatation or vasoconstriction to the cerebral blood flow occurs only beyond this range of 60 to 150 millimeters of mercury is what need to be remembered. I like to ask you a question. What is the weight of the brain? Common anatomy viva voce question. Hardly 2% of our body weight will make us to live 100 years thinking about the things which never happen in our life. The cerebral blood flow is around 50 ml per minute of for every 100 gram of brain tissue, and around 15% of the resting cardiac output at any given point of time will be nourishing the brain, and there are four major ways by which the cerebral blood flow is controlled. That is the metabolic stimulation and autoregulation, chemical autoregulation, perfusion pressure and neural autoregulation. So let us have 1-2 comments about each of them. There are certain important metabolic mediators which will be regulating the cerebral blood flow. They include the hydrogen ion, potassium, carbon dioxide, adenosine, glycolytic intermediates, and even nitric oxide is known to cause the autoregulation of the cerebral blood flow is what need to be remembered. Now coming to hypercarbia as a regulator of the cerebral blood flow. At what level of hypercarbia and what is the relation between the rise of the PCO2 and the rise of the cerebral blood flow? Basically, doctor, once the arterial blood PCO2 increases from the normal value of around 20 to 25 to a value of around 80 millimeters of mercury PCO2, there is a rise to nearly around 2 to 4% of cerebral blood flow for every rise of 1 millimeter mercury of the PCO2 is what you need to basically remember. How about hypoxia leading to increased cerebral blood flow? Basically, the cerebral blood flow will increase only when the PaO2 levels fall below the value of 50 millimeters of mercury. Normally, what is the PaO2 in the regular ambient atmospheric air inhalation, doctor? Around 80 to 85 millimeters of mercury. Unless this PaO2 falls to less than 50, there is no change. And hypoxia, how does it cause cerebral vasodilatation and increased blood flow? Indirectly through the adenosine mediated mechanism, hypoxia will cause the cerebral vasodilatation is what we need to fundamentally remember. Then already we know very well that between 60 to 150 millimeters of mercury of blood pressure, hardly there is any change in the cerebral blood flow at all. Now comes the neurogenic regulation. Is there any regulation of sympathetic nervous system on the cerebral blood flow? If you are angry, if we have more sympathetic innervation, will we have more blood flow to the brain? Fortunately, no. Unfortunately, when we are more angry, we think less. So maybe the reverse scenario is true, that sympathetic output may cause less amount of blood flow, but that is also not true. There is a difference between that of systemic circulation and the cerebral circulation. Unlike the systemic circulation, where the blood flow can be regulated by the sympathetic output, the cerebral blood flow is not generally regulated by the sympathetic system is what you need to fundamentally remember. How do we differentiate acute and chronic malnutrition? What are the various indices available for us? Weight for height. Similarly, we have a height for age and we have a weight for age. There are three very closely looking terminology, but we need to know which is used for what. Weight for height. Suppose if a 6 feet individual happen to have 20 loose motions, he is bound to lose some certain amount of weight. So a fall of weight for height is a indicator not of a chronic nutrition, it is an indicator of a acute malnutrition. But the examiner wants to know which is a indicator of both acute and also chronic malnutrition. Now how about the height for the age? So I am 14-year-old, my younger brother is taller than me, then what is the reason? Because I am not fed well, because elder son always is treated to be the second important guy than the younger brother. So chronic malnutrition will cause height for age to become decreased, which is called stunting. Whereas the weight for age is the parameter which reflects both the acute and also chronic malnutrition, is what you need to fundamentally understand. Once more to summarize, weight for height is acute, height for age is chronic, and weight for age is acute and also chronic is what I want to underscore. Finally, we have the body mass index, which is the weight in kgs by height in meters square, is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now let us go to the next question. What is the best method to compare the results which are obtained by the new test versus that of the gold standard test? If you want to say new test is superior to the old test, how can you say that this is better than that? Which statistical methodology will enable us to know whether the new test is better one or not? Probably 5 years back, the tradition is coaching program is never known to anyone. So in that scenario, we started a new phenomena because we were not getting seats, honestly. So we thought, okay, let us coach the people, at least that way we get the seat. Now it has become a trend. So how can coaching is better than conventional study? Then once more, coaching also now has converted from a straight away conventional classroom coaching to a video based coaching. Then video based coaching also converted from a LCD based program to that of a Reliance Web World program. Like that, we are finally, probably one day will come where to the telephone of the people also we can be able to flash the lecture. So how to say a new method is better than the old method? Let us have 1-2 comments about the statistics. What is a correlation coefficient? Basically, the strength of relation between two variables can be known by correlation coefficient. For example, you have smiled, the other also has smiled at you. Probably it means to say what? Both of you are having some chemistry. But does it mean that you are going to fall in a warm hug and going to live for one lifetime together? It's very difficult to decide that. Simply because you smiled and the other person also smiled. So correlation is only a strength of a relation between two variables, but not the agreement between the two. So it can't definitely say that this smile means only marriage and only pregnancy and only childbirth. It can't be like that. So that is the reason it is only a relation and strength of it. You call it as a perfect agreement only if the points lie along the line of equality constantly. Then only you call it as a perfect agreement. So a perfect correlation cannot be basically be counted only by calculating a correlation coefficient. So how can you perfectly say whether agreement is existent or not? For that, the Bland and Altman analysis basically will help us. What does it do? Basically, it is a statistical method which will allow the statistician to compare two different techniques, and it will plot the difference between the two techniques against their averages and will enable to know whether the newer technique is anyway superior or at least equal to that of the older technique. So that is the whole purpose of using the so-called Bland-Altman analysis. Part textbook doesn't have it, so it is out of syllabus actually. So, but still examiners nowadays are obsessive about asking at least some 10 to 15 questions are out of our conventional textbooks. If you look at the 200 questions in the whatever that we discussed. So no surprise about them. They won't give us the seat. What gives us the seat is those conventional 160 questions. How do you diagnose diverticulosis, colonoscopy or by radioisotope scan? Such things are important. So anyway, to complete the list, let us read about it. How does this Bland-Altman analysis done? You have 3-4 ways by which you quantitate it. Bias minus average difference, precision minus 1 standard deviation, limits of agreement minus 2 standard deviation. They are the various parameters used in the Bland-Altman analysis. Basically, you will be plotting a scatter diagram where the observations which had been done by the gold standard test and the observations done by the newer test are both being plotted, and both of them are compared at the same time, and we'll know whether the newer test is anyway better than that of the older one, or can it be used to replace the older one is basically done. That's the reason, doctor, it is the Bland-Altman analysis which is the answer for this question. Naturally, we'll ask, what is this Kangaroo-Smirnov test? Kangaroo-Smirnov test. What is it basically? It's very simple. It is another statistical test basically. What does it do? Basically, it will look whether two underlying one-dimensional probability distributions differ from one another from that of the hypothesized distribution. For example, you will say that in Hyderabad, the hypothesis is basically every fourth fellow is a maniac. So you have done one study. At the end of the study, you found that no, every second fellow himself is maniac. So hypothesize the distribution of a given variant called, let us say, maniac. How is it from that of an observed distribution of the given variant? Is there any correlation between these two distributions is basically done by the so-called Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, otherwise called KS test, is what need to be remembered. Now let's go to the next question. 5-year-old child has recurrent upper respiratory tract infection, mouth breathing and impaired hearing. What is your diagnosis, doctor? Adenoids and their hypertrophy. This is a repeat question actually from the last AIIMS exam. So there's a reason, doctor, what are the indications for adenoidectomy in the pediatric population you have to be doubly sure about? Number one, if there is any enlargement of adenoid sufficient enough to cause the nasal airway obstruction, like obstructive breathing or obstructive sleep apnea is there, it is the indication for adenoidectomy. Suppose if the adenoids enlargement is causing the recurrent otitis media, typically in children aged 3 to 4 years, or if it is causing recurrent chronic sinusitis, they are all indications for adenoidectomy is what need to be remembered. What is the treatment of the glue ear? This is also a repeated question basically. Myringotomy along with the pressure equalization by placing a grommet tube is considered to be the management of choice, and that pressure equalization tube will automatically extrude itself after 9 to 12 months of the placement. This is another repeat question from the ENT. A young woman had bilateral hearing loss, and what is the type of curve that the audiometry typically will show? It typically shows a curve with what is called as AS pattern of impedance audiometry curve is what need to be remembered. So otosclerosis is the diagnosis in this given case. I am not stretching on these questions because they are all repeat questions. In the last November paper already we discussed them. A man takes the peanut and develops a tongue swelling. Then what is the possibility? Classically, angioneurotic edema, which is an anaphylactic state, is the one which is commonly responsible for such an acute presentation. So which fruit juice is the one which prevents UTI? So already we discussed this, once more a repeat question from the last AIIMS exam. So it is the cranberry. Is it available in India? Maybe. So cranberry juice is very, very good for the UTI, is what you can prescribe to your patient. In spite of your dosing him with ufloxacin, all possible fluoroquinoline, still pustules are appearing in the urine. Really, pyuria and management of recurrent UTI is a taxing job. So cranberry, at least as a last what you call resort, you can provide them. Now what is this Atkins diet? Now we are all in the era of obesity. What is paradox? Unfortunate news about obesity. You pay somebody called obesity slimming center. For decreasing your weight, you need to pay to somebody. That too, for every 1 kg, there is a packaging which is being done. So let us talk about it. What is Atkins diet? Atkins is a great man who recognized that Americans are fat not because of eating fatty foods. He understood that Americans are fat because of eating carbohydrate rich food. So he said, if you want to thin down, don't bring down unnecessarily your fat, try to bring down your carbohydrates. So I still remember one of my friends so fond of potato. Potato curry, potato chutney, potato, everything is potato until he became a wonderful potato. So once more, before marriage he decreased all potatoes, once more became thin. But unfortunately wife was also a wonderful cook of potato. Once more he is a blown out potato. So finally carbohydrate rich food is the one which is responsible making us to blow out. So what he said was, Don't starve the people by unnecessarily avoiding their fat. Try to give them a regime in eating where you introduce 9 different rungs of food. Initially induction therapy, where you give only acceptable vegetables. Then you give them fresh dairy, then nuts, berries, alcohol, legumes, other fruits, starchy vegetables, grains. 9 rung formula of regime was given by Atkins. So you have an induction phase of Atkins diet where the carbohydrate intake is limited to only 20 grams per day. Ongoing weight loss phase, also called OWL phase, it is called as in the Atkins diet, where you have to increase the carbohydrate intake slowly to around 5 grams, and finally lifetime maintenance phase are the 3 phases in remaining thin, really more difficult. And Atkins diet only says try to avoid the high glycemic index foods like the Coca-Cola, fruit juices, potatoes, etc. At the same time enjoy the daily salad which is rich in leafy greens is what need to be remembered. Generally somebody is dieting means, what do they say? I am drinking lot of fruit juices to overcome all this weight I have got. But tell them about the Atkins diet who said that don't take fruit juices, they have rich carbohydrate which can make you to blow out. So Atkins is basically a low carbohydrate diet. So which drug should not be taken in pregnancy? Standard question, ACE inhibitors are the ones which are strictly prohibited. Now if there is a pituitary damage, it is the growth hormone which is the one which commonly falls down, first hormone to fall down. So what are the common causes for the pituitary insufficiency, doctor? Sheehan syndrome, radiation induced injury, etc., etc. This is another repeat question, orchidopexy. In the undescended testes, what is the best age? 1 to 2 years is considered to be the best age. This is also a repeat question once more from November into the May. Carcinoma of the right side of the tongue and lymph node of 4 into 4 centimeters is called what stage of tongue malignancy? You need to remember T1, T2, T3, T4 is the broad classification in the oral cancer. So larger than 2 centimeters, smaller than 4 centimeters dimension is basically called the T2. At least it is 4 into 4, let us put it as N2 is what need to be remembered. A young female complains of primary amenorrhea, but there is a normal sexual development, only thing is there is no pubic hair, absent vagina and absent uterus, then what is the most likely diagnosis? Once more a repeat question actually, but we discussed in lot of our Sunday test this question, but anyway 1-2 comments I will take. There is an entity called androgen insensitivity syndrome, as all of you know very well, just like type 2 diabetes is because of insulin receptor level resistance. So also you have lot of conditions which are receptor level resistance disorders. Even androgen insensitivity is a mutation in the androgen receptor gene. So that is the reason there is a resistance for the androgen receptor to bow itself before the action of androgen. So that is the main problem. So how do they present? If there is androgen receptor level resistance, either they will have under-viralization or infertility as a presentation if they are XY type in their genotype. Suppose if they are of, sometimes even if they have XY genotype also, still they can have a normal female body and they will have undescended testes, and this entity is called testicular feminization. Now where is the androgen receptor in our body is my question to all of you. Is it on X chromosome or Y chromosome? So androgen speaks about male. It is not on male, it is on the, it is not on Y chromosome, it is there on X chromosome is what need to be remembered. So the human androgen receptor is located in the XQ1112 on the X chromosome. That is the reason, like any other X-linked recessive trait, even the androgen receptor insensitivity syndrome also become transmitted, just like hemophilia. Now tell me, doctor, a carrier of the hemophilia abnormal gene, if she is a female, does she show any clinical manifestations? Per se she doesn't, unless she is homozygous for it. Whereas the male, even if one of his X chromosomes, he will have only one X chromosome. So males are more likely to show the abnormality. So the sons of the carrier mothers of the androgen insensitivity are more likely to show the clinical features overtly. So accordingly, doctor, and second scenario, if the female is XX in nature, naturally she has got XX, and this androgen insensitivity receptor is abnormal in both X chromosome, that time also the females can show the clinical manifestations. Now accordingly there is a classification which is being given, where the androgen insensitivity syndrome can be a complete androgen insensitivity syndrome where they will not have any uterus or fallopian tubes, ovaries, but they will have testes in the abdomen, and they will have minimal androgenic hair at the puberty. Like the pubic and axillary hair will basically grow because of the typical androgenic activity, which will become very minimal. Then you have a partial androgen insensitivity syndrome where they will have virilized genitalia, testis in the abdomen, and a sparse or at most a normal androgenic hair. Then you have a Riefenstein syndrome, which is the variant of this androgen insensitivity syndrome, where they have ambiguous genitalia, gynecomastia at puberty, and small testes within the abdomen or scrotum. And so these are all basically the female variants. Then you have the male variants. Infertile male syndrome can be a manifestation of androgen insensitivity syndrome. Under-virilized fertile male syndrome is the second type, and X-linked spinal and bulbar muscular atrophy is also thought to be the manifestation of the androgen insensitivity. So who will come across the spinal and bulbar muscular atrophy, doctor? A neurologist will come across a patient. But actually the problem is with which chromosome? X chromosome, with the androgen insensitivity syndrome. So one of the sixth part in the spectrum of the disorders which occur because the androgen receptor insensitivity would be a spinomuscular atrophy is what need to be basically remembered. Now let's go to the next question. Amniotic fluid has got acetylcholinesterase. Another repeat question we already discussed. So those who joined a little late or now recently joined, you kindly go through all the recent test papers which we discussed last year. We discussed Karnataka 2007, 2006, 2005 paper, AIIMS, All India, etc. Take an opportunity to revise those question banks so that all these are basically repeated questions. Now, the maternal serum alpha fetoprotein, it is useful for the prenatal diagnosis of the abdominal wall defects like gastroscus. But the acetylcholinesterase and pseudoacetylcholinesterase are especially important in the case of the spina bifida diagnosis, is what you need to basically remember. Now, which IUCD has got a half-life of, total period of 10 years. Basically you have copper 380A, copper 200, Nova T, and Lippis loop and multi-load devices like this. So copper T380A has got the copper ions and it is approved for 10 years. And you have the levonorgestrel loaded intrauterine contraceptive devices which contain 20 micrograms of levonorgestrel per day release, and it is approved for 5 years of use is what need to be basically remembered. Now this is a very interesting question. There is a bleeding from the umbilical stump itself at the time of the birth of the baby. Then which important coagulation factor deficiency can present like that? So it's a very interesting question. Can you tell me, doctor, out of all the clotting factor deficiencies, which is the rarest out of all, it is the factor 13 deficiency which is the rarest out of all. And generally clotting factor problem means you will have only problem with bleeding. But one of the clotting factor deficiency also will cause poor wound healing. So which is the one? It is the factor 13 deficiency. So a poor wound healing, abnormal scar formation, in addition to bleeding diathesis, is the problem with the factor 13 deficiency. Now why do you require 13? It is also called fibrin stabilization factor, because when the clot forms, to create a strong and a stable clot, you require the factor 13 is what I want to underscore to all of you. So there is a reason, doctor, in the presence of a factor 13 deficiency, there is a poorly strong, rather a weak clot is what need to be remembered. So it presents like a severe bleeding disorder, recurrent bleeding from the umbilical stump, similarly hemorrhage from a circumcision also, and sometimes spontaneous abortions can be a presenting feature in a elderly female, middle-aged female with factor 13 deficiency. And now the question is, will it lead to surgical bleeding? For example, hemophilia, if it is there, if you are doing surgery, there is a bleeding of surgery. So does it cause a surgical bleeding just like hemophilia, factor 13 deficiency also? If factor 13 deficiency is there, surgical bleeding is not the problem. But after you finish the sutures, and brought the patient to ward, clot which is formed is not a strong clot. So that is the reason it leads to a delayed bleeding. So that's the reason, 3 features you need to remember. Without any impairment of surgical bleeding, a delayed bleeding after surgery is because of factor 13 deficiency. Factor 13 deficiency also causes umbilical stump bleeding. It is the rarest form among all clotting factor deficiencies. It also leads to a delayed wound healing. So these are the things that need to be remembered. Now let's go to the next question. Acute pyelonephritis, if it is there, what are the important findings on the complete urine examination? There can be a gross hematuria, but is it really that common? Generally it is infrequent if it is pyelonephritis. Pyelonephritis means infection at what level, doctor? At the upper urinary tract, almost at the interior of the kidney. Hematuria is more likely to be a cause if the UTI is arising from the lower urinary tract rather than pyelonephritis. That's the reason, doctor. In any case of UTI, if at all you find hematuria, you need to suspect more likely glomerulonephritis or tuberculosis or trauma or vasculitis or calculi to be responsible rather than pyelonephritis responsible for the UTI is what you need to fundamentally remember. But how do you define pyuria? Common ward, bedside discussion. So 5 to 10 WBCs per high power field in a specimen which is being centrifuged at a rate of 2000 RPM for 5 minutes. If you find 5 to 10 WBCs per HPF, then it is called as pyuria, significant pyuria. And the presence of the WBC cause in fact is the most specific out of all features for the presence of acute pyelonephritis. So generally you find greater than 20 WBCs per high power field if it is really a case of acute pyelonephritis is what need to be remembered. Now how about the other tests which are mentioned in this question? Leukocyte esterase test. It also helps, but as a screening test with a good amount of sensitivity rather than specificity. So specificity is 94 to 98 but not 100% with the leukocyte esterase test. Sensitivity is around 75 to 96%. You have a nitrate production test which has a sensitivity of 100% with 85% specificity. So the best thing is you try to combine the leukocyte esterase plus the nitrate production test together, then it is more likely to show the higher specificity and also sensitivity to be confirmatory test for the diagnosis of pyelonephritis. But generally out of all, the best test on any given day to prove that this is a case of definitely pyelonephritis is WBC cause are much more specific than any of these dipsticks is what you need to basically remember. Now I like to ask you, can the nitrate production test can be negative though there is a pyelonephritis in any scenarios? That is, false negatives are possible very much. If the patient is on diuretics, if he is on a low titri nitrate kind of foods. Similarly, if the organisms are not producing nitrate, for example Enterococcus, Pseudomonas, Staphylococcus, they cause UTI, pyelonephritis, but they may not produce nitrate at all. In all those scenarios, the nitrate production test can be negative though the patient has got acute pyelonephritis. So there is a reason, doctor, on any given point of time it is a WBC cause which are highly suggestive of the pyelonephritis, especially if there are more than 5 to 10 pus cells is what need to be considered to be a gold standard test. Now let us talk something molecular. Idiopathic steroid resistant nephritic syndrome. What is the gene which is involved? Absolutely no need of IQ or intelligence for this. Pure reading and luck factor is most important. What is your lucky number you should test? Especially with a negative marking kind of test, no point in trying this kind of suicidal lucks. So NPHS2 gene which encodes for the podocin is the one which is considered to be responsible for the steroid resistant variant of nephrotic syndrome is what need to be remembered. Why is this podocin important? It is important for the glomerular filtration barrier. If it is deficient, even if you give steroids also patient will not respond is what you need to fundamentally remember in relation to nephrotic syndrome. This is one of the oldest questions. Hypertrophic pyloric stenosis, what will happen? We vomit, we become dehydrated, that will stimulate aldosterone. Excess aldosterone will cause sodium retention, H plus loss, potassium loss. So loss of potassium leads to hypokalemia, loss of H plus leads to alkalosis. So hypokalemic metabolic alkalosis is what you see in case of hypertrophic pyloric stenosis is what need to be basically remembered. Y chromosome basically is what type? In fact, our students have by evening have scanned all the questions and sent us handwritten 200 questions of AIIMS. Today we have the privilege. So some of the questions we want to retain their own handwriting also for the next few years to come. So Y chromosome, it is handwriting of one of our Berhampur students. So is what type? Basically this is the typical appearance of the Y chromosome. Some of the literature says X chromosome is a large submetacentric chromosome and Y chromosome is a medium sized metacentric is what need to be remembered. The histopathological changes which are seen in malaria, what is the important change? You find the reticuloendothelial cell proliferation like Kupffer cell hyperplasia, hemozoin pigmentation, portal infiltration. So there is a reason Kupffer cell hyperplasia is one of the characteristic changes is what need to be remembered. Now tell me doctor, what are those special type of granulomas that you see in the brain in cerebral malaria called as Durik's granulomas? Jurik's granulomas, one of the old questions of Robbins pathology. I don't know still is it continuing or not. So Jurik's granuloma are the ones which are seen in brain. Kupffer cell hyperplasia is a feature in the case of the liver. So this is the typical appearance of Kupffer cell predominance with sinusoidal dilatation with the hemozoin pigmentation is what you classically come across. This is the typical hemozoin pigment in the liver biopsy. Hemoglobin electrophoresis is based on what? You need to remember, it is basically the electrical charge which will make the molecule to move at different rates depending on the charge is the underlying basis. So charge and mobility are the gold standards in hemoglobin electrophoresis. Which amino acid is used to donate the ammonia in the kidney? Routinely we discuss this question, urinary ammonium production and how is it important in deciding the urinary anion gap and other things. Whenever H plus ion has to be lost into urine, can we lose like that? No, we can't. We have to convert that into a less toxic metabolite. How is it converted into H plus plus? NH3 gives rise to NH4 plus, which is the one which is excreted into the urine. But who contributes for that ammonium ion in order to capture the H plus ion? It is the glutamate which is very important is what need to be remembered. So we need to remember the glutamate plus ammonia combined to, glutamate basically will be glutamine will be donating the ammonia and divides into glutamate plus ammonia. Ammonia in turn will capture the H plus ion and in the form of NH4 plus ion it is excreted into the urine. There is a reason we require the glutamine which is the contributor for the ammonia in the kidneys is what need to be remembered. What is the most common source of the vitamin A? Basically vitamin A is very rich in the animal foods rather than vegetable foods. Liver, egg, butter, cheese, whole milk, fish and meat are very important. Out of all, it is the fish liver oil which is the richest natural source of the retinol is what I want to underscore to all of you. And the plant foods are very cheap source of, rather the cheapest source of the vitamin A in the green leafy vegetables is what I want to underscore to all of you. So what is the site of renal angle? Two fundamental questions. We don't prepare for this kind of questions. In exam we will be struggling. Erectospinae, quadratus lumborum. Oh, what is the muscle? We also feel a couple of times our muscle. Is it that? Is it this? Anyway, disheartedly we keep some answer and come out of the exam hall. It's quite natural for anyone. How many of you have done renal biopsy? Even if you do renal biopsy, are you sure that that muscle you are touching is quadratus or erector spinae? No problem. So basically we need to know that it is the inferior border of the 12th rib and the erector spinae, not the quadratus lumborum, which is little more deeper, is what you define it as. The renal angle is what need to be remembered. Foramen transversarium basically in which vertebrae is it there? Typically in the case of the cervical vertebrae, because cervical vertebrae have to transmit the vertebral artery. So it is present in all the cervical vertebrae but not in the case of the 7th cervical vertebrae, because vertebral artery does not pass to the 7th cervical vertebrae. 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, everything will have foramen transversarium. So it is typically there in the cervical vertebrae is what need to be remembered. What is the most common site for the intracranial hemorrhage? Fundamental question. We need to know that it is the basal ganglia into which lacunar bleeds are very common, whereas putamen and thalamus are the two most common sites for the hypertensive bleeding episodes is what need to be remembered. So did he ask the lacunar bleed or overall bleeding? So overall bleeding, so that's the reason we can confidently answer it is thalamic. So there are two types, doctor. If it is a thalamic bleed, how do you recognize? If it is a capsuloganglionic bleed, how do you recognize? Look at the morphology of the bleed. If the bleed is horizontally oblong, then it is more likely to be a thalamic. T is like this, no? So thalamic bleed. If it is vertically oblong, then it is more to be a capsuloganglionic bleed. Basal ganglia and the internal capsule got affected is what you can be able to stratify. 35-year-old lady presents with a right upper outer quadrant breast malignancy, then what is the management of choice? Is it only surgery or tamoxifen also? If before giving tamoxifen, what do you want to look for? So basically tamoxifen is the gold standard as a adjuvant endocrine therapy, especially for a premenopausal woman like a 35-year-old female, definitely. But before giving tamoxifen, we need to look for the estrogen receptor status. If the estrogen receptor is negative, then it is good for what? Bad for what? It is good for chemotherapy. So basically estrogen receptor negative is a wonderful marker which will predict the improved response to the chemotherapy, but at the same time it provides minimal benefit from tamoxifen is what you need to fundamentally remember. So you need to ensure what is the estrogen receptor status of the female before planning for the tamoxifen. 3-year-old child has eczematous dermatitis. His mother also had history of allergic diathesis of bronchial asthma. Then what is your diagnosis? This is another repeat question of the last time exam. So these are typical flexural creases where you come across the atopic dermatitis. So this is a typical appearance of the atopic dermatitis, and after giving the oral cephalexin, prednisolone and topical tacrolimus ointment once more, the chubby baby is smiling. So atopic dermatitis, we need to make the correct diagnosis. What is the most common cause for the renal artery stenosis in children? Very tempting question. Definitely it is not Takayasu. Why not Takayasu? Takayasu is the aortoarthritis commonly seen in the young Asian females. Pulseless disease is also called as aortoarthritis. Many times we discuss this. So in pediatric population, do you come across fibromuscular hyperplasia? Very much. But now the question is it intimal hyperplasia or medial hyperplasia? Let us talk about it. Basically the most common etiology in children, renal artery stenosis, if at all it happens, is the fibromuscular dysplasia. But it is the medial fibroplasia type, but not the intimal hyperplasia type is what you need to remember. And which segment is also very, very important. Classically it is the middle and distal third of the renal artery rather than the proximal 1/3 of the renal artery. Now tell me, doctor, the intimal type of fibromuscular hyperplasia, where does it involve? It involves the proximal 1/3 of the renal artery. Another potential question is what need to be basically remembered. So with this, let us conclude with the historical aims discussion, doctor, and thanks for a patient listening. Thank you.